Random secondary. Step to the side.
What indicator triggered that, and what's the selection method for random?
Sir, you don't debate screening. Do what you're told.
I'm complying. I'm asking for your full name and your
I'm
ID
in
number.
charge here. Empty your pockets and stop recording.
All right, this is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Because on paper, this was a closed-door judicial conference, a room full of judges, a controlled venue, a standard security checkpoint. And yet a federal judge still got treated like a threat, purely off a random screening that got very unrandom the moment he asked basic questions. Holloway had stepped up to the checkpoint at the downtown convention center like everyone else. The scanner didn't beep. His bag didn't flag. He didn't argue with anyone, didn't act nervous, didn't do anything that looked even remotely suspicious. But a security officer still pulled him aside for secondary screening and labeled it random. Holloway didn't explode. He didn't posture. He did what people with real composure did when they sensed a game being played. He slowed everything down and made it official. He asked for full names and ID numbers, calmly, clearly. He confirmed the checkpoint cameras were recording. Then he pulled out his phone and started filming, not as a threat, but as documentation. That's when the officer and her supervisor got defensive. Not because he was being difficult, because he was turning their random moment into a record. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from. City and state. And if you like stories where calm, documented accountability beats power trips, hit like and subscribe. Now here's how it really unfolded. The checkpoint itself looked routine. Stanchions, trays, scanners, uniformed staff moving people through fast. The kind of setup that trained everyone to keep walking and not ask questions. Holloway didn't give them a reason to stop him. Nothing on the equipment flagged, no alarms, no alert from the screen, no call out from another officer. Yet he was singled out anyway. The security officer told him he'd been selected for a random secondary screening. Holloway, still calm, asked what exactly had triggered it. What indicator, what policy, what selection method? The officer didn't answer with facts. She answered with attitude, and that was the first tell. The second tell was the supervisor. Instead of stepping in to clarify the process, the supervisor stepped in to back the officer's authority. He treated Holloway's questions like disrespect, like the act of asking was the problem. So Holloway made the interaction even more structured. He repeated his request for names and ID numbers. He noted the time. He glanced at the camera placement and verbally confirmed it was capturing audio and video. He kept his voice level while making sure the situation couldn't be summarized later as routine screening. Then they moved to the search. They pat-searched him anyway, even though nothing had flagged. They unzipped his briefcase and spread the contents out on the inspection table. They handled documents and electronics with the confidence of people who expected him to swallow it and move on. Holloway stayed composed and continued filming, and the deeper they dug, the more the tension changed. Because at some point, they hit a leather portfolio. Something about it, its formatting, markings, the seriousness of what it contained, made them slow down. Then the realization landed. He wasn't just some attendee. He was a judge. And it showed on their faces immediately. An instant flash of panic, the kind that happened when someone realized they'd been wrong in a way that could cost them. But instead of stopping, instead of correcting, instead of offering even a minimal apology, they doubled down. They kept searching like they needed to prove the search had been justified all along. Like backing off would be admitting the obvious, and then they crossed the line. They demanded Holloway power on his laptop. That wasn't a pat-down anymore. That wasn't secondary screening. That was access. Holloway didn't shout. He didn't make threats. He noted what was happening and kept his phone steady while an officer clicked through folders and opened sensitive court materials, documents that weren't supposed to be viewed at a public checkpoint by anyone without authority. And that became the moment the story stopped being about random screening and became about abusive process. They dragged it out, found nothing, and finally let him go with a clipped non-explanation. No apology, no accountability, just a push to get him moving so the line could keep flowing. They acted like the problem would disappear if he walked away, but Holloway didn't walk away from it. He walked into the conference and then quietly started building a case. He collected witness contact information from people who had seen the interaction and heard key parts. He wrote down times, names, and what each staff member had said. He requested preservation of security footage and screening logs before anyone could lose them. He filed formal complaints through multiple channels, so there wouldn't be one gatekeeper who could bury it. And that was the mistake they didn't realize they'd made at the checkpoint. They didn't just stop a man. They stopped someone who understood systems, records, and consequences. Holloway didn't make a scene at the conference. He didn't walk in and announce what happened. He did something more effective. He treated the checkpoint incident like the first page of a file. Within hours, he had a clean timeline. When he arrived, when he was pulled aside, how long the search lasted, who touched what, who ordered what, and the exact moment the laptop was accessed. He had names and ID numbers. He had witness contacts from people who saw the search stretch past secondary screening into something else. And he had his own video showing tone, procedures, and the refusal to give a real explanation. Then he moved to preservation. He sent written requests to preserve checkpoint camera footage, screening logs, and any random selection records tied to that time block before anyone could claim it had been overwritten or wasn't retained. He included dates, time ranges, and the exact checkpoint lane. He made it impossible to misunderstand what needed to be saved. And then he filed complaints through multiple channels on purpose. Not one complaint, several. Because he understood how these systems buried problems. One inbox, one supervisor, one internal review that ended in silence. So he split the path. Venue security leadership, the conference's administrative authority, the contracted security company, if applicable, and the federal oversight bodies that cared when sensitive court material was accessed by unauthorized personnel. That's when the resistance showed up. The first responses tried to shrink the story. They framed it as a routine screening. They leaned hard on the word random. They avoided addressing the laptop access directly. They offered vague reassurance instead of facts. Holloway didn't argue emotionally. He answered structurally. He pointed to what the equipment did and didn't do. He pointed to the length and depth of the search. He pointed to the escalation after he asked what triggered the screening. And he put the laptop issue in writing as the center of gravity. Sensitive judicial materials had been opened at a checkpoint by someone with no authority to view them. That single point forced the matter out of customer service complaint territory and into security breach territory. Because now the question wasn't whether the staff had been rude. The question was who had accessed protected information and why. As soon as that was clear, the tone of the system changed. Not apologetic, cautious. Requests started coming back for his documentation. Someone asked for the witness contacts. Someone asked whether he still had the video. Someone asked whether he could identify which checkpoint camera was facing the inspection table. And behind the scenes, they did what institutions always did. When a complaint looked expensive, they started searching for patterns. That was the part nobody at the checkpoint expected. Because Holloway's case wasn't isolated. It was just documented cleanly enough that it couldn't be ignored. When the logs were pulled, random selection didn't look random anymore. It looked consistent in the worst way. Black professionals flagged at a noticeably higher rate than others, especially in the morning rush and just before high-profile sessions. Then the deeper problem surfaced, the complaint process itself. There were previous complaints, some formal, some informal, that had been resolved without real review. Some had been closed with boilerplate language. Some had never made it past the same small group of supervisors. A few were quietly categorized as misunderstandings and filed away without preserving footage. And once someone finally compared dates to staffing schedules, a second pattern appeared. The same officer squad combinations showed up again and again around the complaints. It wasn't just bias in the lane, it was protection behind the desk. At that point, outside scrutiny became inevitable. Either the organization invited it, or it was going to get forced on them. And Holloway kept pushing in the only way that matters. He insisted on written answers, preserved records, and independent review, because he knew that without oversight, the system would do what it always did. It would wait for the person to get tired. Holloway didn't get tired. Once the patterns started showing, the people in charge didn't respond with honesty first. They responded with containment. The security contractor and venue leadership did what institutions usually did when a complaint threatened to become a headline. They tried to frame it as one bad interaction, one misunderstanding, one random screening that simply looked unfortunate. But Holloway's documentation made that strategy impossible to hold. Because this wasn't just a complaint about being pulled aside. It was a complaint that included preservation requests, witness names, timestamps, and a clear allegation that sensitive court materials had been accessed at a checkpoint by personnel with no authority. That forced escalation. Internal reviewers were suddenly required to answer questions they normally avoided. Who ordered the laptop power on? Who touched the keyboard? What exactly was opened? Whether any data was copied, and whether the random selection method had any audit trail. And when those answers didn't come quickly or came back vague, Holloway did what experienced people did when they saw the stall tactic. He widened the circle again. He pushed it into independent oversight, channels that didn't report to the same managers who needed the problem to stay small. That meant outside investigators, compliance offices, and legal counsel. People who cared less about workplace harmony and more about liability policy and federal standards around information security. That's when the truth got sharper. The random selection process on paper was supposed to be neutral, either a true algorithmic pick or a simple interval system. But the logs and staffing practices didn't match a neutral process. The data showed clusters. The same staff were repeatedly making random choices, and the random outcomes weren't evenly distributed across demographic groups. In plain terms, it looked like discretion dressed up as math. Worse, the complaint pipeline had been designed to bury heat. Complaints were routed through the same limited chain, often closed without full footage review, and sometimes recorded in ways that made them hard to search later. It wasn't an accident. It was a safety valve, built to protect the organization, not the public. And once outsiders saw that, the issue stopped being, did staff treat one person unfairly? It became, was there an ongoing pattern of discriminatory screening in a system that quietly hid it? That shift changed the tone overnight. Now, leadership wasn't just facing a civil rights problem. They were facing a governance problem. The review expanded. More footage windows were pulled. More screening logs were sampled. More complaints were reopened. People who had previously been ignored were contacted again. Black attorneys, consultants, executives, professionals who had described the same thing for years. Random selections that happened too often, followed by defensive staff the moment questions were asked. And once multiple accounts lined up with data, the organization ran out of room to pretend. The legal response moved fast after that. Holloway's case wasn't treated as a private disagreement. It became the anchor point for a major civil lawsuit because it wasn't just discrimination. It was the unlawful access of sensitive judicial materials conducted publicly, then followed by institutional stonewalling. The suit did what lawsuits often did when internal systems failed. It forced discovery. That's where organizations lose control. Because discovery demanded emails, training materials, policy drafts, internal complaint notes, staffing schedules, and the decision trail behind which footage was preserved and which wasn't. It pulled the curtain back on how random had been used as a shield. And with that pressure came consequences that weren't optional. Staff were terminated. Supervisors who had enabled the pattern were removed or reassigned. The security contractor faced contract penalties and public scrutiny, and once settlement talks started, it stopped being about saving face and became about limiting damage. The settlement was massive, multi-million-dollar territory, because the exposure was massive. Not only had discrimination been demonstrated, but the organization had allowed sensitive court materials to be accessed without lawful authority, then tried to minimize it. That combination was a legal and public relations nightmare. And importantly, the resolution didn't end with money. It came with reforms that could be measured, a redesigned random selection system with documented rules and audit logs, required supervisor sign-off for any extended secondary screening that went beyond a pat-down and bag check. After the settlement and the firings, the venue tried to sell the outcome as a clean reset. New policies, new training, new language about equity and professionalism. The kind of public-facing response organizations leaned on when they needed people to believe the problem had been fixed. But the people who'd been randomly selected for years didn't measure change by slogans. They measured it by what happened at the checkpoint. And the checkpoint did change, because now it had oversight built into it. The random selection process was no longer something a screen could claim, while a human quietly chose. It became auditable. Selections were logged automatically. Secondary screenings beyond a basic check required a documented reason and, in some cases, supervisor sign-off. Camera retention rules tightened. Complaints didn't disappear into the same internal loop. They went to an independent intake channel with timelines attached. The most important reform wasn't the policy text. It was the fact that the system now assumed someone would verify the system. That single expectation, someone checking, was what removed the old confidence staff had operated with. Because before Holloway, the worst consequence for a biased random selection was a complaint that could be buried. After Holloway, the consequence was evidence, data, footage, discovery. And people behaved differently when they knew the record would be real. For Holloway, the outcome wasn't framed as a victory lap. He didn't treat it like he'd won a personal battle. He treated it like he'd prevented future harm. He understood exactly what the checkpoint had been, a situation where staff felt entitled to expand their authority the moment someone didn't submit quietly. And he understood the deeper insult. They'd only panicked once they realized who he was. That was the whole story in a snapshot. Not just discrimination. Discretion plus ego, protected by a complaint system designed to absorb outrage and release nothing. So Holloway did what the system wasn't built for. He refused to let it absorb him. He turned the moment into a record, and the record into leverage. He kept it tight. Names, times, witnesses, preservation requests, multiple complaint channels. He made it impossible for one person to handle it quietly. Then, when the institution stalled, he forced the problem into a process it couldn't control, outside scrutiny and legal discovery. That was the real play, not anger, structure. And if you take anything from this story, it was this. Bias loved vague procedures. Accountability loved details. So here's the question for you. If you were in his position, would you have just moved on to avoid the stress? Or would you have done the work to make sure it didn't happen again to the next person? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've ever been singled out in a space where you did everything right, share what happened.
I need both of your IDs right now.
Are we being detained? What crime are you investigating?
A report came in. Just give me your IDs.
A report of what exactly? And what law says we have to identify without reasonable suspicion?
You're making this difficult. Don't play games.
We're not playing games. We're asking if this is consensual or
All right, this is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Officer Suarez stood over their table like the decision had already been made. He told the two black men he needed their IDs immediately because a waitress had reported they were planning a bank heist. He said it like it was normal, like it was a reasonable thing to accuse two customers of while they were eating. The men didn't raise their voices. They didn't get up. They didn't scramble to prove anything. They did the one thing Suarez clearly hadn't expected. They started asking whether they were being detained, what specific crime he suspected, and what law he believed gave him the right to demand identification. Suarez didn't answer cleanly. He repeated the waitress's report. He leaned on authority. He implied consequences. And as nearby diners started looking over, his posture shifted from checking on a call to winning a standoff. Right then, the whole moment stopped being about safety. It became about control. Quick thing, tell me where you're watching from. City and state. And if you like stories where people stay calm, know the rules, and force accountability when someone abuses power, hit like and subscribe. Now rewind. It started the way these things usually started. Someone got uncomfortable, gave their discomfort a dramatic name, and handed it to the police like a fact. A waitress saw two black men talking at a table and decided what she was hearing couldn't be normal conversation. Maybe she caught words like schedule, vault, or bank. Maybe she didn't even catch the words, just the vibe she assumed. Either way, the report that made it to Suarez wasn't two customers are being loud or two people are arguing. It was they're planning a bank heist. And Suarez treated that report like it gave him permission to turn a lunch into an interrogation. He walked in, went straight to their table, and opened with a demand instead of a question. Not a greeting, not a check-in. A demand for ID, right away, right in front of everyone. The two men held the line calmly. They didn't talk back the way people like to label it. They asked structured questions that forced Suarez to either justify himself or admit he couldn't. That's where the chess game began. Suarez tried the common moves. He framed it as an investigation, hoping the word itself would end the conversation. When that didn't work, he tried intimidation, suggesting he could make things inconvenient. Then he tried embarrassment, letting his voice carry, letting the room notice, making the men feel like refusing him would make them look guilty. But the men didn't give him the reaction he wanted. They stayed controlled and kept returning to the same points. Detention or not, crime or not, lawful basis or not. And because Suarez couldn't name an actual crime, he got stuck in the only place officers get stuck when they don't have facts. He started policing attitude. He warned them about tone. He implied they were being difficult. He suggested that refusing to comply was suspicious by itself. The manager drifted close, trying to smooth it over the way managers often did, by asking the targeted people to sacrifice their dignity so the room could stay comfortable. The men didn't take the bait. They didn't insult anyone. They made it clear that comfort wasn't a legal standard. By then, the whole restaurant felt it. This wasn't a quick check anymore. This was an officer trying to force compliance without the foundation to demand it. And just as Suarez edged toward escalation, just as it looked like he might try to create a reason to justify his presence, a third person stepped in. Not loud, not dramatic, just decisive. That person addressed Suarez directly and told him to step away from the table. Then, with the kind of calm that only came from real authority, they revealed what Suarez hadn't known when he walked in. The two men weren't random customers. They were undercover detectives. And Suarez's body language changed instantly, like someone had flipped a switch behind his eyes. He stopped posturing. He softened his voice. He began backing out of the moment he'd built. Because now it wasn't just two black men refusing to be bullied. Now it was oversight, consequences, and a record that wouldn't be easy to rewrite. Suarez's whole posture changed the moment the third person identified the two men as undercover detectives. He stopped talking like he was in charge of the table. He started talking like he was trying to get out of a mistake. The third person, calm, clipped, clearly not there to debate, asked Suarez the same question the men had been asking the entire time. What specific articulable facts gave him reasonable suspicion that a crime was happening? Suarez didn't have anything new. He went back to the waitress report again, but now it sounded weaker, because the room had already watched him build an entire confrontation on it. That was the point the detectives didn't even have to say out loud. If the only thing that changed was Suarez learning who they were, then the issue wasn't safety. The issue was who he believed deserved automatic respect. Suarez tried to pivot into polite professionalism. He said he was just responding to a call. He implied it was routine. He tried to make it sound like he would have treated anyone the same, but his own behavior contradicted him in real time. Before the reveal, he had been firm, impatient, and ready to escalate over a refusal to identify. After the reveal, he got careful. His voice lowered, his hands stayed still. He started apologizing, and the detectives didn't reward it with friendliness. They didn't threaten him. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't perform for the restaurant. They held him to the standard he'd avoided: facts, not feelings. Through the narrator's lens, it was simple. The detectives kept their questions tight and gave Suarez no emotional material to twist into aggression. They kept the interaction on the record. They made sure the third person heard the full timeline. Suarez's demand, his inability to name a crime, his pressure tactics, his tone shift. That's also when the environment changed. You could feel diners recalibrating. The same people who were nervous a minute earlier now looked at Suarez differently. A couple of phones stayed up, not because the moment was dramatic, but because it was educational. This was what it looked like when authority got audited in public. Suarez's exit was quick. He backed away from the table, gave another short apology, and left the restaurant without IDs, without names, and without the compliance he'd tried to force. And because it ended quietly, some people would have wanted to call it no harm done. But the detectives didn't treat it like that. They treated it like evidence. Because they knew what almost happened. A patrol officer had walked up to two black men eating lunch, accused them of plotting a serious felony based on a vague report, demanded identification without clear lawful basis, and escalated the interaction when they asked basic questions. And the only reason it stopped cleanly was that the men at the table were law enforcement too. That part mattered more than the apology. After the restaurant, the accountability chain started the way it always started, when someone smart refused to let the moment disappear. First came documentation. The third person who stepped in made sure the incident was noted immediately, who responded what the initial call claimed, what was observed on scene, and what Suarez could or couldn't articulate. Dispatch logs existed, that bank heist call existed. If there was body camera footage, it existed too. And it captured the shift: demand, pressure, vague justification, and then the sudden politeness when status was revealed. Then came the complaint. The detectives didn't file it because they felt insulted. They filed it because they understood what the same encounter would look like for two regular black men with no backup, no chain of command walking in, and no reason for Suarez to suddenly become careful. They framed it the way complaints that stick are framed. Not emotion first, but policy first. Consensual encounter versus detention, reasonable suspicion, demanding identification, threatening consequences for refusing an unlawful demand. And most importantly, how the officer's tone and behavior changed only after learning who the men were. That last piece was hard to explain away, because it raised the question supervisors hate having to answer. If the officer was willing to push this far on the public, what did he do in private when no one recorded him? Once the complaint hit the system, Suarez couldn't outrun the paper trail. The supervisors didn't need a dramatic investigation to understand the core problem. The call itself was already thin, planning a bank heist with no concrete details. Then the footage and logs showed what happened next. Suarez walked in, skipped straight to demanding IDs, and couldn't clearly explain a lawful basis when the men asked if they were being detained. That sequence mattered because it turned the situation from checking on a suspicious person call into detaining people based on a feeling. And the department had to treat that seriously because this wasn't some hidden hallway moment. It happened in public, in a business with witnesses. In modern policing, public moments are never just public anymore. They're recorded, requested, reviewed, and compared. So the review centered on three things. 1. What dispatch actually received. They checked what the waitress said, how it was coded, and what details were included. A real heist report should have specific indicators, names, a weapon mention, maps, threats, casing behavior, anything. This call didn't. It was essentially a dramatic interpretation of two people talking. 2. What Suarez observed for himself. Supervisors looked for the part where Suarez could articulate, I observed X, which led me to suspect Y. That part was missing. He relied on the report and then tried to force compliance when questioned. 3. How he escalated and why he de-escalated. This was the uncomfortable part for Suarez, the contrast. Before he knew who they were, he pressed. After he knew, he softened. Even if he never said anything outright, the shift told its own story. The department's response was realistic and procedural, not cinematic. Suarez was pulled in, questioned, and required to write his version of events. Then he was confronted with the reality that vague suspicion doesn't justify detention and that refusing to provide ID isn't automatically a crime in most situations unless specific conditions apply. His consequences were the kind that actually happen: a formal reprimand, mandatory training, and a note that stayed in his file. Depending on the agency and his history, it could include a short suspension or being placed under closer supervision for a period. But the detectives weren't satisfied with a quiet slap on the wrist that changed nothing. They pushed for a practical fix, a reminder to patrol officers about the difference between a consensual contact and a detention, and how suspicious person calls from businesses had to be screened for bias-based vagueness, not ignored, screened. Two black men talking couldn't be treated like actionable intel just because it was packaged with a scary phrase. The restaurant got its own fallout. Management couldn't pretend it was nothing once it became clear the accusation had been extreme. Even staff who wanted to defend the waitress had to face what she had actually set in motion: an armed officer confronting customers over an imagined felony in a room full of people without real evidence. The waitress didn't become a cartoon villain in the aftermath. She became what these situations usually reveal: a person who felt fear or suspicion, labeled it danger, and expected the system to handle it without questioning her assumptions. That's why the detectives treated this as bigger than Suarez. Because Suarez didn't invent the suspicion alone. He inherited it, accepted it, and escalated it. And the most important part, the part that stuck with people who witnessed it, was how simple the difference was. Nothing about the detective's behavior changed after the reveal. Only Suarez changed. That became the lesson, the quiet proof, the thing you couldn't unsee once you saw it. After Suarez left the restaurant, the moment didn't feel over for the two detectives. It felt exposed, because what happened wasn't complicated. Two black men sat down to eat. A staff member attached a violent story to them with no real facts. A patrol officer treated that story as enough to demand compliance. And when the men stayed calm and asked basic legal questions, the officer tried to turn the encounter into a power contest. Then one detail changed. Someone revealed the men had status inside the system. And suddenly, the same officer who couldn't explain a lawful basis found his manners. That contrast became the lasting evidence, not just for the detectives, but for everyone who witnessed it. In the weeks that followed, the case didn't become a viral spectacle in this version of reality. It became something quieter, which is often how real change happens: paperwork, meetings, and uncomfortable conversations, where people have to stop hiding behind vague phrases. Suarez's supervisors reviewed the incident as a liability problem and a policy problem. They didn't have to guess what happened. Dispatch logs and footage captured the entire arc. The initial accusation, the demand for IDs, the repeated refusal to clarify detention, and the tone flip after the undercover reveal. That made it hard to rewrite. So the department responded in layers. First layer, corrective action for Suarez. He was required to account for his decision-making. He was reminded formally that vague suspicion from a third party didn't automatically equal legal grounds to detain. He received documented discipline and retraining focused on consensual encounters, reasonable suspicion, and escalation control. And whether the punishment was mild or serious, the key thing happened. It became part of his record. Not a rumor, a file. Second layer, guidance to prevent repeats. The detectives pushed for a procedural reminder that business calls needed to be handled with clearer thresholds. Not ignored, just not blindly accepted. If the suspicion was essentially a vibe dressed up as danger, officers needed to slow down and verify before turning customers into suspects. It wasn't a grand reform. It was a guardrail. And guardrails matter. The restaurant had its own reckoning. Managers hate admitting the truth in these situations. Staff can turn bias into a police response with one phone call. And once it's done, the targeted person carries the risk, not the caller. So management reviewed the decision chain, what the waitress actually reported, what she claimed she heard, whether anyone tried to ask questions before dialing 911. They updated training, clarified guidelines, and made it clear that they looked suspicious wasn't a reason to involve law enforcement. The waitress faced consequences that fit real workplaces, coaching, discipline, and a new understanding that her assumptions could have gotten someone hurt. She may not have intended harm, but intent didn't erase impact. And after that, the restaurant's staff had to live with the uncomfortable reality. Their dining room had been the stage for a double standard. For the detectives, the outcome wasn't satisfaction, it was clarity. They'd handled the confrontation the way they'd been trained to handle dangerous uncertainty. Stay calm, stay structured, don't give the other side emotional fuel, and keep forcing the interaction back to objective rules. But privately, they couldn't ignore the part that haunted the whole thing. If they weren't detectives, if they were just two regular black men with normal jobs, Suarez might have pushed it further. He might have demanded they stand, might have searched them, might have decided non-compliance was the crime. And later, he might have written it up in a way that sounded clean. That's why they filed the complaint anyway. Because the real issue wasn't that a cop bothered two detectives. It was that the system only relaxed once it realized the men at the table belonged to it. And that's the moral that sticks. Power will test your boundaries when it thinks you don't know the rules. And the simplest form of protection, sometimes the only safe one, is calm, documented accountability. So here's the question for you. If you were sitting at that table, would you have known how to respond without escalating it? Would you have felt safe enough to keep asking, am I being detained? What crime? What suspicion? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever had someone try to turn a feeling into authority over you, share your story too. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, grounded story times like this. Because the next person at that table might not have anyone walk in to change the tone.
Step out of the vehicle. Give me your ID.
Sir, what legal reason are you detaining me for? The plate authorizes the spot.
Don't argue with me. ID, now.
I'm asking a legal question. What probable cause do you have to demand ID?
You're acting suspicious.
Suspicious isn't a crime.
You are not free to leave.
Captain Brent Harlan stood at the driver's door and told Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman he was not free to leave. Coleman stayed seated. He kept his hands visible. He asked what legal reason supported detaining him. Harlan did not give a clear offense. He treated Coleman's questions like the problem. Officer Lacey Torres noticed Coleman's phone and pointed out it was recording. Harlan immediately tried to control that. He ordered Coleman to stop recording and keep his hands where they could be seen. Coleman refused to stop recording. He stated he was documenting the contact and that he was not reaching for anything. A bystander, Nina Patel, started recording from a few cars away. At that moment, this stopped being a parking question. It became a detention, captured from more than one angle. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from. And if you think probable cause shouldn't be optional just because someone has rank, hit like and subscribe. This happened in Texas in a public parking lot near a government office and nearby businesses. Handicap spaces were close to the entrance. People were walking in and out, passing close enough to hear the tone shift. Coleman had parked in a handicap spot because walking long distances was difficult for him. He was in uniform. He was not hiding. He was not causing a scene. He was sitting in his vehicle before going inside. The entire context started because there was no placard hanging from the mirror, but the vehicle had disabled veteran plates. The plate already explained the authorization. That was the first important choice in this story. Verify first or confront first. Captain Harlan chose confrontation. He approached and focused on the missing placard. He told Coleman he could not park there and demanded identification. Coleman did not raise his voice. He did not argue about respect. He pointed out the plate and asked why ID was being demanded if the plate already explained the situation. Harlan repeated the demand. Coleman shifted the encounter to procedure. He asked what probable cause existed to require ID. That question changed the dynamic. It forced Harlan to either explain legal authority or admit the demand was based on preference. Harlan did not explain a specific offense. He labeled Coleman suspicious. Coleman responded in the same controlled way. He challenged the idea that suspicion alone was a crime and redirected Harlan back to the proper step. Run the plate and verify. That was the second important choice. Solve the issue with verification or treat the refusal to hand over ID as defiance. Harlan treated it as defiance. He ordered Coleman to step away from the vehicle. Coleman did not move quickly. He asked if he was being detained. Harlan answered by restricting Coleman's freedom to leave. That was the turning point in the encounter. A routine parking check became a detention without a clearly stated legal basis. Coleman asked what he was being detained for. Harlan framed it as failure to comply. Coleman clarified the issue again. Asking an officer to explain authority was not the same as refusing a lawful order. He kept his tone even. He kept his hands where they could be seen. He kept the focus on one question: what legal reason justified holding him? Harlan did not provide a clear crime. Instead, he tried to control the environment. That was when the phone became the new target. Officer Torres noted the recording. Harlan immediately pushed for the recording to stop while also directing Coleman's hands and posture. Coleman refused to stop recording. He stated he was documenting for accountability and safety. He emphasized he was not reaching into pockets, the console, or any compartment. He stayed seated and still. That removed an excuse officers sometimes rely on. If the person does not move, the encounter cannot be justified as a reaction to movement. It has to stand on the original reason for contact. And the original reason was a parking assumption that could have been verified by the plate. Nina Patel's recording from outside mattered for a different reason. It captured the overall scene, where everyone stood, what the vehicle showed, and how the encounter looked to the public. It also captured the disabled veteran plate as part of the wider frame. Now there were multiple recordings of the same detention. Coleman stayed consistent. He did not perform anger. He did not perform fear. He did not give Harlan anything that would make escalation look reasonable later. He kept the encounter focused on justification, not personality. Harlan kept trying to shift the issue away from the plate and toward obedience. He repeated commands. He implied the problem was cooperation rather than legality. But the more he leaned on rank and repetition, the clearer the record became. This was a detention built from a misunderstanding, then held in place because Coleman asked lawful questions. Captain Brent Harlan kept the detention active and tried to reframe the situation so it looked like Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman was the problem, not the initial mistake. Harlan repeated the same point about a placard and treated the disabled veteran plate like it did not settle the issue. He kept coming back to one demand: identification. Coleman did not argue about respect or tone. He stayed seated, kept his hands visible, and repeated two questions in order: whether he was being detained and what specific legal reasons supported it. Harlan did not name a clear offense. He tried to build one. He shifted from parking to behavior. He implied that Coleman's refusal to provide ID was non-compliance. Then he implied the recording itself was escalating the contact. Officer Lacey Torres watched the way the detention was developing. She stayed near the captain but did not mirror his intensity. She was paying attention to what would matter later, what was said on camera, what the plate showed, and whether there was any lawful basis being stated. Harlan issued more directions. He tried to control Coleman's hands, posture, and phone at the same time. The commands were structured to create a simple story. The officer gave instructions the citizen refused, and that refusal justified escalation. Coleman refused to give him that story. He stated he was documenting. He stated he was not reaching for anything. He stated he was keeping his hands visible on purpose. He stayed still so there would be no excuse to claim sudden movement or a safety threat. That forced Harlan to rely on the original reason for the stop, and the original reason was a parking assumption that could be checked immediately. Nina Patel continued recording from outside. Her angle showed the broader scene, where the officer stood, where Coleman's hands were, and the vehicle's disabled veteran plate in the frame. At that point, Torres made a suggestion in a low voice: verify the plate through dispatch. It was the simplest off-ramp. It also limited damage. If the plate verified, the detention ended. If it didn't, enforcement became straightforward. Harlan resisted that off-ramp for a moment. His focus was not verification, it was control. He acted like Coleman's calm questions were defiance, and acted like compliance was the goal. Coleman stayed consistent. He told Harlan to run the plate. He made it clear that if there was a real violation, verification would show it. Harlan finally did what he could have done at the start. He radioed dispatch and ran the plate. The response came back consistent with what the plate already indicated. The disabled veteran's status was legitimate. The vehicle was tied to Coleman. The parking authorization was not in question. At that moment, Harlan had a choice. He could end the detention cleanly and admit the contact was based on a misunderstanding. Or he could try to protect his ego by shifting the reason after the fact. He tried to shift it. He began talking about policy instead of law. He implied that even if the plate verified, Coleman still had to provide ID because he had been asked. He tried to make the central issue Coleman's cooperation, not the captain's decision to detain without a stated offense. Coleman did not debate in circles. He asked one follow-up that forced clarity. If the plate was verified and no crime existed, what legal basis remained to keep him detained? Harlan could not answer that without admitting the detention was being used to punish Coleman for asking questions. Torres stepped in again, more direct this time. She signaled that the parking concern was resolved and that continuing to hold Coleman would create a bigger problem than releasing him. Harlan's posture shifted. He backed out of the detention in a controlled way, trying to make it look like a normal conclusion rather than a retreat. He told Coleman he could go, but he tried to leave a warning behind, as if the lesson was cooperation rather than legality. Coleman did not accept that framing. He stated the key point without raising his voice. The plate had been the answer from the beginning, and this had escalated because verification was skipped. Before ending the contact, Coleman did what people did when they understood accountability. He asked for Harlan's name and badge information. He noted the time. He noted the location. He noted the presence of Officer Torres. He noted that Nina Patel had recorded from outside. He kept it factual. Then he ended the encounter with a short statement that set the boundary. Rights did not require permission, and lawful authority required justification. Harlan left without the outcome he wanted. Coleman stayed seated for a moment longer, still recording the final seconds. No emergency, no crime, no threat. Just a detention that ended only after the plate was finally verified. And Coleman did not treat it like a social media argument. He treated it like the start of a paper trail. After the encounter ended, Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman did not treat it like a debate. He treated it like documentation. He saved his recording. He contacted Nina Patel and secured her outside angle too. 2 videos meant the department could not later reduce the story to tone or misunderstanding. The angles showed the same core facts. The plate was visible, the detention was stated, and the justification was never clearly named. Within days, Coleman filed a formal complaint with the department's Internal Affairs Professional Standards Unit. He kept it structured. He listed the time, location, and identities he had. He identified the exact moment the contact shifted into detention, when Captain Brent Harlan told him he was not free to leave. Coleman requested specific records: body camera footage from Captain Harlan and Officer Lacey Torres, any additional body cam footage from nearby units who arrived or monitored, any dash camera footage if a patrol unit was positioned in the lot. When Internal Affairs contacted Coleman for intake, they asked what outcome he wanted. Coleman answered in general terms: accountability, training, and the truth on record. That answer mattered because it forced the complaint into a category departments could not dismiss easily. He was not asking them to be nicer. He was pointing to procedure and authority. While the complaint was in process, the video began circulating. Veteran groups shared it. Community pages reposted it. People focused on the same sequence. The plate existed, verification was delayed, and detention was declared anyway. The department responded publicly with controlled language. They acknowledged the video and said the incident was under review. Behind the scenes, the complaint triggered a routine the public rarely saw. Internal Affairs had to pull footage. They had to review the dispatch and CAD logs. They had to compare what officers said on video to what was documented afterward. They had to determine whether the contact matched policy. Coleman stayed consistent during that period. He did not trade insults with strangers online. He did not add new claims. He kept pushing for records and policy language. Then he made the next move that usually changed how a department handled a file. He contacted a civil rights attorney. The attorney did not ask about disrespect. The attorney asked about lawful basis and sequence. They asked how long Coleman was held after the plate was verified. They asked whether the vehicle was blocked in. They asked whether Coleman's ID was demanded again, taken, or run. They asked whether anyone threatened arrest or punishment related to recording. They asked whether the stated reason for detention shifted over time. The attorney told Coleman they were not litigating attitude. They were litigating justification. Coleman's response was simple. That was the same question he asked in the lot, and Captain Harlan never answered it. At that point, the pressure stopped being public attention and became formal risk. Because once attorneys requested records and Internal Affairs had footage and logs in hand, the department had to decide what they could defend on paper and on camera. And if the camera showed a detention without a clear legal reason, the department's problem was no longer the video. It was the record. Once Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman filed the complaint and his attorney began requesting records, the department had to treat the incident like a case file, not a comment thread. Internal Affairs pulled what mattered first: body camera footage, KAD dispatch logs, and any written documentation created by Captain Brent Harlan or Officer Lacey Torres. The review focused on sequence. It was not about whether Coleman sounded upset. It was about whether a lawful reason existed to demand ID and then announce detention. The main comparison was simple: what was said in the parking lot versus what was later claimed in writing. If the footage showed the disabled veteran plate clearly and showed Harlan still escalating, that narrowed the department's options. They could not reasonably argue that verification was impossible. They could only argue why they chose not to verify first. If any report tried to add a new reason later, something not stated during the encounter, that created a credibility problem. The record would show whether the legal basis existed in real time or was built afterward. Publicly, the department stayed careful. Their statements stayed brief. They were aware of the video and the incident was under review. Privately, supervisors treated it as a risk issue. A captain's decisions carried more weight because captains trained and modeled conduct. If Harlan escalated without clear cause, it raised a bigger question than one bad interaction. It raised whether leadership was using detention as a control tool. During the review, the department moved in two directions at once. First, they tried to contain the narrative. They framed it as a routine contact that became tense, instead of acknowledging that the detention began from a parking assumption that could have been verified immediately. Second, they looked for a resolution that reduced liability. That usually meant corrective action and policy clarification without a public admission. Coleman kept his approach consistent. He did not argue online. He did not threaten people. He kept everything pointed at process, what the policy allowed, what the law required, and what the footage showed. His attorney pressed for the full set of materials, all body cam, all logs, all reports, and the relevant policies and training documents. The request itself changed the department's posture because records were now being prepared with the assumption that others might review them. As the review progressed, the department typically reached a decision point. If the footage clearly contradicted Harlan's justification, they leaned toward corrective action and internal training updates. If they believed they could defend it, they leaned toward a statement that the contact was within policy, even if it looked bad. If the legal exposure was high, they leaned toward resolving it quietly through counsel. No matter which path they chose, one outcome was hard to avoid. The department had to clarify how officers were expected to handle disabled veteran plates and handicap parking. And they had to clarify what actually supported an ID demand in a detention. For Captain Harlan, consequences depended on what the footage showed and what the department could defend. At minimum, leadership had to address why a detention was declared without a clear offense. For Coleman, the result was not about winning an argument. It was about forcing an accurate record. He had stayed calm in the lot, and now the department had to answer in writing for the choices made on camera. When the internal review reached its end, the department did what departments usually did in situations like this. They kept the public message short, and they handled the real decisions internally. The statement stayed controlled. It acknowledged the incident and confirmed a review. It did not debate details. It did not admit wrongdoing in plain language. But internally, the outcome showed up in the places that mattered. Policy guidance was clarified. Supervisors reinforced verification steps. The department emphasized that handicap parking concerns required confirmation before escalation, and that disabled veteran plates were not optional information to ignore. They also clarified how officers were expected to handle ID requests and detentions. If an officer could not articulate a lawful basis, the contact could not be treated like a detention just because the person asked questions. That part was not theoretical. It mattered because the key failure in Coleman's encounter was simple. Captain Brent Harlan used detention language without a clear legal reason, after a plate check could have resolved the issue. For Captain Harlan, the consequences depended on what the footage and records showed. If Bodycam and the bystander angle clearly captured the plate and captured Harlan escalate in any way, the department had to address it as a leadership problem, not a misunderstanding. A captain was expected to model correct decision-making. When a captain escalated without justification, it created risk for everyone under him and risk for the city. So the corrective actions often came in the standard administrative forms: documented counseling, mandatory retraining, and supervisory review. In stronger outcomes, It could affect leadership standing or assignments. The department did not need to publicly announce every step for the steps to be real. For Officer Lacey Torres, the file usually reflected her role in the sequence and what she did or did not do to slow the escalation once it became clear the plate was valid and the detention was on camera. For Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman, the result was not about a parking spot. It was about a record that could not be rewritten. He had stayed calm. He had kept his hands visible. He had asked the correct questions. He had documented the detention. He had filed a structured complaint. He had requested the records. And when the process moved slowly, he involved counsel, so the department had to treat the file with seriousness. If legal resolution was discussed, it followed the same logic the attorney gave from the start: justification and sequence. Not attitude, not tone, not whether the veteran could have made it easier. The question was whether the department could defend a detention that began from an assumption and continued without a stated legal basis. Even when departments avoided public admissions, the practical outcome was clear. Guidance changed, oversight tightened, and the behavior that created the problem became harder to repeat quietly. And that was the point. Coleman did not win by getting louder. Coleman won by staying controlled and creating a record that forced accountability. Because the moment an officer says a person is not free to leave, the burden shifts. The system has to justify that restriction with something real, not a label, not irritation, not rank. So here's the question. If you were in Coleman's position and a captain told you that you were not free to leave, but could not name a lawful reason, what would you do? Hand over ID to end it fast, or keep asking for justification on the record? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you've been in a situation where power was used instead of procedure, share what happened. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and focused on oversight and accountability, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Stand up, turn around, you're being detained. Do it now.
Stop. Don't put your hands on me like I'm a suspect when you can't name a crime.
I don't need to argue with you. Hands behind your back.
You're trying to cuff the owner of this shop in front
That's
of my
what you're
staff
doing.
and customers.
This booth is covered by security cameras with audio, and she's recording too.
The wild thing about the story was how ordinary it looked at first, and this is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we get into it, I want one thing from you. Say where you're watching from in the comments. City, state, country, whatever you're comfortable with. And if you care about stories where people quietly stand their ground against profiling and abuse of power, hit like and subscribe so more people actually see this. By the time the officer had his hand on the cuffs, Derek Cole was already standing. He had been in the corner booth of his own coffee shop, laptop open, bank tab on the screen, when the patrol officer walked straight over and turned a normal Tuesday into a detention. Now the officer was inches away, one hand hovering near Derek's wrist, the other resting on his belt, blocking the path out of the booth. The shop was mostly empty. One guy near the window, headphones on, a woman at the bar with a book, Maya the barista, frozen behind the counter. Music played at low volume, just enough to underline how quiet everything else had become. The officer kept repeating that he needed to see Derek's ID, not because of a call, not because of a report. He had already admitted there was no complaint, no suspect, no described crime. He just said the man in the corner looked suspicious and might be casing the place, or might have done something to the owner. He said it while standing 3 steps away from the actual owner. Derek had asked for a legal reason. The officer never gave one. Instead, he shifted into questions about Derek's legal status, asked if he was in the country lawfully, and hinted that people who had nothing to hide never refused to show ID. Each time Derek repeated that he was not required to hand over ID under those conditions, the officer's tone got sharper. He announced that he was detaining Derek, told him to stand up, and leaned in like he expected a fight. Derek stood, kept his hands visible, and still did not raise his voice. That was the moment when the power game changed from just words to physical control. The officer started to take Derek's arm to turn him for cuffs. What the officer did not notice, at least not right away, was the black dome in the ceiling corner above the pastry case. Security cameras had a clear angle on the corner booth. Another camera covered the entrance. Both had audio. Both backed up to the cloud without anyone touching a button. He also did not notice the small movement at the counter. Maya had taken her phone out, angling it just enough to keep both men in frame. She did not say anything. She just held it still. From the officer's perspective, this was simple. A lone black man in a hoodie in a mostly empty shop, not sitting at the counter, not behind the bar, refusing to show ID and asking legal questions he did not like. In his mind, that added up to trouble. From Derek's side, it was very different. He had been reviewing vendor invoices. He had opened the shop at 7 a.m., done the morning rush, handed the bar to Maya, and sat down to handle the numbers. His coffee cup, with the shop's logo he had designed himself, was still on the table next to his laptop. To understand how they got to the cuffs, you have to back up about half an hour. 30 minutes earlier, Cornerstone Cafe had looked exactly like any other small urban coffee shop, trying to get through a slow mid-morning. Derek had done what he did most weekdays. He checked the espresso machine, restocked the pastry case, and went over the schedule with Maya. The early crowd had come and gone. A couple of remote workers had settled in with laptops. The place was calm. Derek was not dressed like people imagine a business owner. He was in a black hoodie with the shop logo, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. No apron, no name tag. He liked to blend in with his own customers when he wasn't on bar. People who knew the shop knew him. People who didn't usually assumed he was just another regular. Around 10:15, a marked patrol car rolled slowly past the front windows. The officer inside, Ryan Keller, glanced in and saw a nearly empty room and one black man alone in the corner with a laptop. He did not see any argument. He did not see anyone waving for help. He did not see anything being stolen. He just saw a scene that, in his mind, felt off. Instead of keeping driving, he circled the block, doubled back, and parked. He did not radio in a call. He did not report a disturbance. He told himself he was just doing a welfare check and making sure nothing had happened to the owner he claimed to know. When he walked in, Maya greeted him like any other customer. He did not respond. He did not ask her if everything was okay. He scanned, locked onto Derek, and walked straight toward the corner booth. From the start, his questions were not neutral. He asked Derek what he was doing there, then immediately demanded ID. When Derek asked what this was about, Keller said he wanted to make sure he belonged there, mentioned that he knew the owner, and implied that Derek might be casing the business or had done something to the person who ran it. Derek kept his answers short. He said he was sitting in a coffee shop working on his laptop. He said he was not obligated to provide ID without cause. He asked if there had been a call. Keller admitted there had not. He said he had just seen something that looked suspicious and decided to come in. Instead of backing down, he pushed further. He started asking where Derek was from originally, whether he was a citizen, whether he had any outstanding warrants. None of those questions had anything to do with someone sitting in a chair with a paid-for drink in front of him. Maya watched the shift. The customers watched it too, even if they pretended not to stare. Keller's body language changed as soon as Derek did not immediately comply. His stance widened. His voice got louder. He repeated that he needed ID and that Derek was now being detained for refusing. Derek reminded him that simply sitting in a coffee shop was not a crime and that the officer had not named any law he was suspected of breaking. He pointed out that the officer had entered without any call for service and was now escalating based on nothing more than a feeling. That was when Keller reached down toward his cuffs. He told Derek to turn around and started to take his wrist. Derek did not yank away, but he did straighten and look him dead in the face. He said as evenly as he could that the officer was currently trying to cuff the owner of the shop during business hours without a legal reason. He said he had operated Cornerstone Cafe for years. He said he personally knew Captain Angela Reese, the precinct commander, who came in regularly. He told Keller that this entire interaction was on his own security system and now on at least one phone in the room. He added that if Keller kept going, the next place they would see each other would be in court, in a case about unlawful detention and profiling, with video from every angle. That was the exact second Keller's expression changed. And that was where the real story began. For a second, nothing moved. The officer still had one hand on his cuffs and the other on Derek's wrist. Derek had just finished telling him, in a steady voice, that he was putting hands on the owner of the business in the middle of business hours, with no complaint and no identified crime. He also told him that every inch of it was being recorded. He mentioned the ceiling cameras and Maya's phone, and he repeated that he knew the precinct captain personally and would be taking the stop to court as unlawful detention. That combination finally landed. Officer Keller's eyes went up to the camera in the corner, then to Maya's phone, then back to Derek. His grip loosened. The cuffs stayed in his hand, but the intent shifted. He stepped back half a step, still trying to hold onto authority. He said he was only checking on the safety of the business, said he had the right to make sure nothing was wrong, and tried to frame the whole thing as routine. He used the word misunderstanding. He did not mention that there had never been a call. Derek did not sit down. He did not pretend nothing had happened. He reminded the officer of what had just occurred. He told Keller that this was exactly the kind of behavior that departments claim they are trying to fix, and that this specific stop was now documented from 3 angles plus Bodycam. He added that if the officer chose to continue, he would be doing so knowing in advance that civil litigation would follow. Maya stayed behind the counter, still recording. The 2 customers kept watching. Nobody was confused about who had crossed the line. Keller tried one more time to salvage his version. He said he knew the owner and had been worried something had happened. Derek answered that if the officer truly knew the owner, he would have recognized him, or at minimum, checked with staff before treating him as a suspect. That fact was undeniable. Keller had not asked a single question at the counter. Before zeroing in on Derek, the officer's posture changed again. The edge in his voice faded. He put the cuffs back in their case. He adjusted his belt and announced that he was not arresting Derek and that he was leaving. He repeated that he had only been trying to make sure everything was okay. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the profiling. He just walked out. The door closed behind him. The shop went quiet except for the low music and the espresso machine. For a moment, Derek stayed standing. His heart rate was up, but his voice, when he finally spoke to Maya, stayed normal. He asked her to stop the recording and save it. He asked the customers if they had seen what happened. One nodded. The other said they had it on video as well. Derek sat back down at the corner booth, but he did not go back to his spreadsheet. He opened a blank document instead and started typing out a timeline. Time the officer walked in. What was said? When the first demand for ID was made. When legal status came up. The moment hands went on his wrist. The exact point when he identified himself as the owner and named the captain. He pulled the footage from the cafe system to an external drive. He made sure Maya's clip and the customer's clip were backed up. He stored copies in cloud folders under neutral names. By the time he closed the laptop an hour later, the incident was written out in detail, with timestamps and a list of witnesses. The confrontation inside the shop was over. The next part would not be face-to-face. It would be paperwork, email, and internal review. Right after the officer left, Derek did not argue with anyone, and he did not post anything online. He focused on evidence. He locked the front door for a few minutes and checked the security footage. The cameras clearly showed the officer entering with no visible emergency, walking past the counter, going straight to Derek, demanding ID, grabbing his wrist, and then backing off only after Derek said he was the owner and mentioned the captain in court. Maya's phone video had clear audio of the officer talking about legal status, saying he knew the owner, and admitting there had been no complaint or active case. Derek saved everything. He exported the shop's camera clips, backed them up in the cloud, and saved Maya's video and a short clip from a customer who had recorded when the cuffs came out. Then he documented it in writing. He made a timeline. Time the officer entered each demand for ID, when legal status came up, the physical grab, the moment he identified himself as the owner, and when the officer left. He kept it factual with no exaggeration and attached the badge number he had read off the uniform. He filed 3 things: a formal complaint with Internal Affairs through the city system, listing the incident as unlawful detention and biased conduct in a public business, with all witnesses and video noted. A direct email to Captain Angela Reese explaining that one of her officers had tried to detain the owner of Cornerstone Cafe with no complaint, no crime, and on-camera references to legal status. A contact to a civil rights attorney stating that he was exploring legal action for unlawful detention and profiling, and that full video evidence existed. Inside the department, the case was opened under a complaint number. Internal Affairs pulled the officer's body cam. The captain viewed it with them. The body cam confirmed Derek's version. No call for service, no visible threat. A man calmly sitting with a laptop. Repeated demands for ID without cause, immigration-related questions, and an attempt to cuff him that stopped only after he revealed he was the owner. They compared that to the short report the officer wrote at the end of his shift, which tried to frame the incident as a safety check with a non-compliant subject in a possibly burglarized business. The video did not match that description. At that point, the investigation was no longer optional. It was on record, with video, with the business owner fully cooperating and represented. The incident had moved out of the coffee shop and into official files, where it would follow that officer's name from then on. The investigation did not drag on for years. It moved fast because the evidence was simple and complete. Internal Affairs finished their review and wrote it down in clear terms. The officer had entered a private business without any call, decided on his own that a man sitting quietly was suspicious, demanded ID without reasonable suspicion, used legal status questions with no connection to any crime, and initiated physical detention of someone who was not suspected of anything. They concluded that his written report did not match the video. They marked his statements as inaccurate and his conduct as out of policy. Keller was pulled from patrol. First, it was administrative leave during investigation. Then it became a suspension without pay for a set number of days. He lost eligibility for certain assignments. A formal reprimand went into his file. He was ordered to complete remedial training on constitutional stops, bias, and interactions in businesses open to the public. It was not just a slideshow. It was monitored, documented, and tied to his performance reviews. At the same time, the city attorney's office looked at the footage and Derek's complaint and saw risk. They knew a lawsuit could pull all of this into federal court and public records. The body cam would not look good on the stand. Derek's attorney laid out the claims: unlawful detention, racial profiling, and interference with his business. The videos supported every point. The attorney did not make threats. They submitted a detailed demand letter with timestamps. The city chose settlement before a lawsuit was filed. Derek agreed to a monetary settlement in certain terms. The agreement covered his claims for the detention, the profiling, and the impact on his business. Some details stayed confidential, but the key facts did not change. The city acknowledged policy violations, and the officer did not walk away clean. Inside the department, the case did more than punish one person. It turned into a training example. Captain Reese pushed for changes. A written directive went out to patrol officers that said, for walk-in suspicious person checks in open businesses, officers must first contact staff or visible management if it is safe. ID demands must be tied to specific articulable suspicion, not just a feeling that someone doesn't belong. Questions about immigration or legal status are prohibited unless directly tied to an active investigation where that information is legally relevant. Reports must match Bodycam. Any major mismatch triggers automatic review. Supervisors started using the cafe footage in internal briefings. New recruits watched how the stop began and how quickly it turned bad once the officer relied on assumptions instead of facts. They saw how fast it changed again when the owner asserted his position, named the captain, and referenced court. In the neighborhood, Cornerstone Cafe stayed open like always. Regulars kept coming in. A few new customers showed up after hearing about what happened. Some had seen the incident mentioned in a small local article that covered the investigation and policy changes without naming last names. Derek did not turn the story into his brand. He did not hang the settlement check on the wall. The only visible change in the shop was a small sign near the register with a simple message about cameras, transparency, and respect. Behind the scenes, he kept a printed copy of the official apology letter from the department and the closure notice from internal affairs in a folder in his office. It was not there as a trophy. It was a record that when someone tried to treat him like a suspect in his own place, he did not just swallow it and move on. The tiny detail that had saved him was simple. He was the owner, he had cameras, he knew exactly who to contact, and he was prepared to follow through. He knew that not everyone gets those advantages. Not everyone has video, a direct line to a captain, or a lawyer ready to answer an email. But his case went into the system. His incident sat in that officer's file. His complaint helped write a policy that would be sitting in front of the next rookie in the academy. That is how one ridiculous moment became something that actually changed procedure. This was not a viral screaming match. There were no broken doors or big headlines. It was a quiet stop, a bad decision, and a man who refused to let it slide because he understood exactly what had just happened to him. Now think about you. What would you have done in his situation? Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong in a place that was yours, or that you had every right to be in? Drop your experience or your thoughts in the comments. Someone else reading might need to know they're not alone. And if you want more real stories about power, profiling, and people who stand their ground with evidence instead of noise, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.